as stated by the legendary XKCD and others, biology is applied chemistry, or applied biochemistry if you want an intermediate step. Biochemistry is, of course, applied chemistry. Chemistry is applied physics, and physics is applied math. Well, intelligent life is applied biology, and math is applied observations, or the mathematical laws that we have are applied observations, and observations are applied intelligent life. Hey, wouldn't that short-circuit reality? Well, yes, it would. Why? The problem is that all the mathematical laws that we come up with, they are our best available interpretation of reality. Which means that reality is applied math. The reverse is not so true. Math is theoretical reality. Yeah, okay. So for the most part, we aren't going to spend too much time on physics or math because after all, this is a bio course. But chemistry, well, we have something called biochemistry for a reason. It's even considered a whole other field because it's so huge and complicated and so required for biology. But there are many things you can study in biology that don't involve biochemistry. And, well, this chapter, we're going to talk a little bit about the basic chemistry behind life. Biochemistry is actually going to be a little later. So basic chemistry, well, we probably remember from way back when that matter consists of chemical elements in pure form and combinations of elements called compounds. Now, when we discuss chemistry, we have to have symbols because just using words gets really long really fast. So some chemical names, well, they actually originate from study of biology. So biology is applied chemistry, but chemical names originate from biology. Nice circular going there, guys. So formic acid, the Latin for ant is formica, and formic acid is named for ants because, well, it's commonly used by ants as a disinfectant. Anyone who's ever been stung or bitten, depending on terminology, by an ant will tell you that it burns. It's about the same sort of burn because after all, formic acid, methanoic acid, which is this, this is acidic, so it'll burn in about the same way as, say, putting vinegar on an open wound. Please don't try this. Alternatively, you can think of it as similar to having a needle puncture that then has vinegar applied inside of it. Needless to say, this hurts quite a bit. But it probably wasn't initially used as that for most ant species. It was probably initially evolved as a disinfectant, and then it turned out that it's great to dissuade predators. Alright, some species, such as Myrmelaschista schumani, who wants to guess if this was discovered by a guy named Schumann? Well, anyway, this species uses it as an herbicide. An herbicide is used to kill herbs or kill plants in general. So there are patches of forest in the headwaters of the Amazon in Peru that are populated entirely by a species named Doroea hirsuta. And this species of tree, tourists in the past and explorers asked the natives, hey, are you guys maintaining these gardens? And the natives are like, nope. We call them devil's gardens because there's a legend about an evil forest spirit. Yeah, actually these ants live in the hollow trunks of these trees, and they can kill plants that try to grow there that are not of this species by injecting their leaves with formic acid. This kills leaf tissue, and eventually enough leaf tissue dies that the plant dies. Now, if the ant colony manages to survive, it can expand its territory over time by attacking other plants besides Duroia. So this type of ant colony can last for hundreds of years, potentially. Even if the older queens die off, it could be that new colonies move into the stand of Duroia trees and colonize them before other trees overgrow these. And then we have the Acacia ants, which are another example of trees that have hollow parts, although it's not hollow stems, unlike Duroia. Trees that have hollow parts that use ants as their symbionts in a mutualistic relationship. And acacia trees actually provide food for the ants. They've converted predators into, well, mercenaries, pretty much. So, that is something we can discuss later when we talk about, say, mutualism, about symbiosis in general, and so on. You should remember from past chemistry classes that all these organisms and all these chemicals and elements that we're naming and discussing, they are all composed of matter, which is anything that takes up space and has mass. Now, elements cannot be broken down into other substances by chemical reactions. They are all atoms of the same, well, element. So they're all the same, and they are all atoms, right? No. White phosphorus, for example, is composed of molecules that are P4. So it's a tetrahedron, so it has an equilateral triangle as its base, and, well, all sides too. So, white phosphorus, well, that's an element. It can't be broken down into anything else by chemical reactions, but it's also molecular. Compounds, on the other hand, may be molecular or ionic. Now, these compounds, they are made of some combination of, well, usually the naturally occurring elements, because the ones that are not naturally occurring generally have pretty short half-lives, and we don't isolate their compounds very often. We generally acknowledge 92 elements, so up to uranium. The transuranics are beyond uranium. So up to uranium as naturally occurring in appreciable quantities. However, depending on definition, you might have 90 because promethium and technetium were first synthesized in labs before they were discovered in nature. But depending on definition, you could go up to, say, about 98. So up to element 98. Beyond that, well, they get really heavy and really unstable, so your element symbols will usually be the first letter or two of the name. Many of these names will be from Latin, such as natrium for salt. Well, sodium is Na. And German, well, Wolfram is their word for tungsten. And guess what tungsten's elemental symbol is if you look at a periodic table? It's a capital W. Compounds, well, we have different elements, 2 or more, combined in a fixed ratio, such as water or table salts or acetic acid. These generally have very different properties from the pure substances. We can think of this as a matter of emergent properties. After all, anybody who tries to tell me that water doesn't have very different properties at most temperatures compared to molecular hydrogen or molecular oxygen, which are its natural forms, no, those are gases. And then, well, water is a liquid at room temperature. Of course, if you heat them all up high enough, sure, they all become gases. Wonderful. But I don't think that's what we're looking for. So, nitpicking aside, the elements of life, about 20 to 25% of them are considered essential elements, which are required by organisms to live healthily and reproduce. Depending on the organism, reproduction may require additional elements. We will discuss an organism's niche eventually, and stuff like tolerance range versus optimal range and range at which it can reproduce. Yeah, these are different concepts, but this will vary a lot by organism. The list of required elements, so essential elements. For humans, we have 25. Plants generally only need 17. But of course there is species variation. So this table is one that you can find in a lot of textbooks. And we see that 4 elements make up about 96% of our bodies. This actually holds reasonably true for most organisms. Oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen make up around 95 to 97% of their bodies, depending on the organism. Usually we just state 96% because the variation is actually very, very small. Calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium occur in concentrations greater than 0.1% by body mass. And these are still very important. But the trace elements, they are required in considerably lower quantities. Now, often you see these becoming deficient, whereas these you don't see being all that deficient very often. Why? Well, the more of it you need, the less deficiency you can tolerate. For example, say a region has a carbon deficiency. Great, you've just significantly reduced the chance of carbon-based life from showing up there. Now, of course, on Earth's surface, this is kind of hard to visualize compared to, say, nitrogen deficiency, where soil that has little organic material decaying in it tends to have low nitrogen content and be pretty bad at supporting new plant life. Carbon, well, that comes around in the air as carbon dioxide, which kind of makes carbon deficiency kind of hard. Nitrogen deficiency, though, is very, very obvious, even though it takes up a lot of the body mass, because, well, it's just so important. Now, for these nutrients, calcium deficiencies can be remedied by adding bones or, say, eggshells. Phosphorus, well, phosphate is actually really common, but if we're doing this agriculturally, yeah, potash is about it for major sources of phosphorus. If you use, say, urine, that contains a lot of phosphorus as well as a lot of nitrogen, which is considered pretty good for plants. But, of course, if the concentration is too high, that can result in osmotic water loss from the plants, which is bad. Potassium, well, we can get a lot of potassium from, say, bananas. Sulfur, we get sulfur from eating proteins. Sulfur is used to make proteins. Nitrogen is used to make, well, nucleic acids and proteins. Nitrogen, well, it's actually pretty hard to get a nitrogen deficiency for a human as long as they consume reasonable amounts of protein material. But if proteins are lacking in the diet, well, a lot of the amino acids humans require can be synthesized by ourselves, but we do have essential amino acids that we have to take from our diet. So please make sure that you get enough protein. Of course, having too much, that kind of puts some strain on your excretory system because you have to get rid of the extra amine groups, which are converted to ammonia and then urea. Ammonia is highly toxic. Urea is not so toxic, but either way, it requires a lot of water to get rid of. Sodium and chlorine are required for maintaining osmotic balance and conducting. Sodium and potassium are used to conduct nerve impulses. Magnesium, well, that's used for a whole lot of things, which we can discuss later. Otherwise, we'll be here for even longer of a while than this book will actually take. The trace elements, well, a lot of these end up being pretty toxic pretty quickly compared to these. I mean, sure, everything's toxic in excess, but selenium, for example, it's required for healthy prostate function. It's also used for, say, selenocysteine, which is cysteine except with a sulfur replaced by selenium. We don't usually cite selenocysteine as one of the 20 amino acids humans use, but it is used. Now, trace elements may or may not be required depending on the organism. So specific trace elements, like say iron, well, that's required for all known life forms. Notice the disclaimer, all known life forms. This is part of the uncertainty of science. We can never be sure that we actually know everything. No. If you are sure you know everything, that's called Dunning-Kruger Syndrome, also known as too incompetent to know that you know nothing. Like, there are actually curves plotted jokingly as to perceived knowledge level, actual knowledge level. And it looks something like this. Mountain of ignorance, valley of depression, and then slowly going up to some level where it's complicated is your go-to response. Yeah, well, other micronutrients, yeah, okay. We call them trace elements for now, but micronutrients is also a very common term. Are only required by particular clades, such as vertebrates requiring iodine to synthesize our thyroid hormones. These regulate our metabolism. If you don't get enough iodine, well, your thyroid ends up trying to increase its size so that it can produce enough thyroid hormone, and you end up with a huge lump growing out of your throat. This is called goiter. And this is a problem in the developing world if seafood and iodized salt are unavailable. Salt, in many countries, is iodized to prevent goiter. However, sea salt, if you buy it in a store, it will usually say uniodized. So be careful with that. You'll need some seafood to make sure you have an adequate intake of iodine. This seafood, depending on country, usually the recommended choice is seaweed, which is pretty easy to cultivate compared to catching other seafood. And it's also not often as expensive as, say, fish. So, this of course depends on regions and difficulty of shipping and so on. All right, so nutritionists among you, or to be nutritionists, would be nutritionists. You might be going, wait a second, well, why are you calling these micronutrients when we know that micronutrients are vitamins and minerals? Minerals. So trace elements are technically all part of micronutrients. Vitamins are the other part. Vitamins are compounds that are synthesized mostly of these and partially of these, depending on the vitamin. Macronutrients, well, there are stuff like carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, but we can discuss that stuff later when we talk about animal digestion and nutrition. So, if we have toxicity at high levels, just like with everything else ever, water will kill you if you drink too much of it at once. So, tolerance to toxicity, well, if you have soil toxicity, usually the most commonly cited one, at least in North America, is serpentine soil. And it's formed from the erosion of ultramafic rock. Ultramafic rock has very, very low silica content compared to what usually comes out of a volcano. But that's still like, just less than 45%. So, there's still some silica in there, but it's a minority instead of the usual. This type of rock contains minerals of what is called the Serpentine Subgroup. Now, depending on which mineral you're talking about, the appearance may vary, but it tends to appear jade-like and contains significant amounts of chromium, nickel, and cobalt. Now, we know that these are required for some organisms in trace quantities, but we also know that, for example, the Sudbury region, when it was using massive scale nickel extraction and they weren't dealing with their pollutants well, the ground was pretty barren because of all the deposited metals, such as nickel. Most plants can't survive in serpentine soil. We see in this image a stream that has very little vegetation around it. If this soil was more hospitable, then quite honestly we would probably not even see the stream because of all the vegetation hanging over it. So, these organisms, these few species that we can see, how can we know that there are separate species? Well, this one has a distinctive stalk in the middle, so it has a stem. These seem to be just leaves. Hey, that looks remarkably like a dandelion. But anyhow, these look like some type of grass. So these organisms happen to be able to tolerate the boundaries. At least their ancestors were able to tolerate the boundaries of this serpentine soil zone where it happens to mix with less inhospitable soils. Okay, hey, if the competition for sunlight and water is dying off because it's too toxic for them, that means that the organisms that have better tolerance will be able to access more resources and reproduce freely or more freely. The result is that more tolerance is selected for, and over time these adaptations accumulate because of random errors when producing offspring. These are called mutations. We'll discuss them later. And eventually you end up with a serpentine soil community where other plants just can't grow there, whereas they prosper. Alright, let's consider some problems. In this image, why is there less vegetation near the stream? I mean, we know that a normal stream is going to be relatively overgrown. and hung over with a whole lot of vegetation shading it. Whereas here we see nothing next to the stream. Also, a regular stream may or may not have aquatic plants. Streams often don't, because the water flow in streams is just so fast that aquatic plants can't anchor themselves well enough before being washed away. Okay, plankton is also generally not found in appreciable quantities in streams because of this same problem. The flow rate is usually too quick. Is flow rate the right term? No, actually, for hydrology, the flow rate is the overall discharge, generally, and it's the current. So the current speed, or speed of current, or just current, depending on who you ask and what grade levels you're discussing this at. So, why aren't there plants shading all over this thing? Because after all, plants like being near sources of water, right? Hey, serpentine soil does weather over time. Its toxic metals leach into water sources. Well, it seems that these plants do not have quite enough tolerance to deal with water that has lots of dissolved metals in it. Metals leached into water. Now, another example that we often have to deal with for soil toxicity is aluminum. Aluminum leaching is a particularly nasty consequence, and unfortunately common, of acid rain. And aluminum is toxic to plants when in notable concentrations. Alright, let's think of another problem. So a micronutrient deficiency. Well, calcium deficiency we know well causes fragile bones and bone deformations such as, say, rickets in humans. But what about something that's less abundant, like, say, iron? Well, iron is used in hemoglobin, which is what humans use as a respiratory pigment to carry oxygen around the body. So a deficiency of iron will result in reduced oxygen carrying capacity of blood. So we call this anemia. Now there are many other potential reasons for anemia, but iron deficiency was one of the relatively common ones, at least in pre-modern times. Now, to get iron, there are certain plants that have naturally relatively high iron concentrations, but red meat is still pretty much a go-to for obtaining iron. The red meat is actually not a matter of being filled with blood. It's because of myoglobin, which is related to hemoglobin. Myoglobin binds oxygen on its own. Now the muscles, when they are working, they spend the oxygen attached to myoglobin, and the myoglobin pulls oxygen from hemoglobin. Why is this better than just the muscles pull oxygen straight from the blood? Well, first of all, you have a reserve capacity for oxygen. And, well, what else? Okay, say you have a car with a very small fuel tank. After all, there's gas stations everywhere, right? Yeah, is it going to be very convenient for you to have to stop and refuel very often? That's what muscles picking up oxygen directly from the blood is like. Assuming, of course, that we're talking about fast-twitch oxidative fibers or slow-twitch oxidative fibers instead of fast-twitch glycolytic. Glycolytic muscle will tend to look white because it relies on glycolysis for much of its ATP. You can see this in terms of chicken breast muscle, where unlike birds that actually fly, the meat is white. The dark meat on the chicken leg, well, that's mostly going to be fast-twitch oxidative fibers. Now, it is possible to convert between the two types, hence why working out is able to increase muscle endurance. All right. Myoglobin is like adding a bigger fuel tank to your car. Having to go further before you have to refuel is pretty convenient when refuelings are not that common. So when the body is exercising or perhaps chasing after prey or whatever, if you have myoglobin buffering the new pulse of blood arriving, then the changes in oxygen level are not so abrupt within the muscle. This helps make sure that the muscle can continue performing without reducing itself to fermentation, which builds up lactic acid and is not very good for muscle chemistry. Anemia, reduced muscle endurance, from lowered myoglobin. Of course, there are also other symptoms because these aren't the only things iron is used for. But these are the big ones, especially the anemia. Well, that's it for this section. We could do some other problems, but I think that's quite long enough for discussing the basics of elements and compounds and some of their effects on biology. So, see you later.